The studio lights felt unusually hot as Jonathan Roumie shifted in his chair, trying to maintain his composed smile for the cameras. Marcus Williams, the veteran interviewer known for his ability to break through celebrity facades, sensed there was something deeper beneath Jonathan's polished responses about The Chosen. For 40 minutes, they had discussed the show's success, the challenges of filming, and the impact on audiences worldwide. But Marcus could tell that Jonathan was holding something back, something profound that was just beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed. "Jonathan," Marcus said, leaning forward with the intensity that had made him famous for getting to the heart of matters. "I have one more question, and I want you to really think about your answer." The actor nodded, expecting another question about his preparation for the role, or perhaps his future projects. Marcus paused, studying Jonathan's face carefully, before asking the question that would change everything. "If Jesus walked into this room right now, what would you say to him?" The question hung in the air like a sacred moment, and Jonathan's carefully constructed composure began to crack. Have you ever witnessed the exact moment when someone's deepest truth breaks through their public image? What happens when an actor who has spent years portraying Jesus suddenly faces the reality of that relationship in his own life? This is the remarkable account of how one unexpected question shattered Jonathan Roumie's defenses and revealed a faith journey so profound that it left everyone in the studio speechless, including the man who had brought Jesus to life for millions around the world. Jonathan started, his voice barely above a whisper, as he processed the weight of Marcus's question. He looked down at his hands, then back up at Marcus, his usual confident demeanor completely gone. "I wouldn't say a word." His voice cracked on the last word, the emotion catching him completely off guard. The confession seemed to surprise even Jonathan himself, as if he hadn't known this truth was living so close to the surface. He blinked rapidly, as if trying to process what he just admitted on live television in front of millions of viewers. Marcus leaned forward, sensing something profound was happening in real time. "What do you mean?" he asked gently, his interviewer instincts telling him to tread carefully in this sacred space. Jonathan's eyes were beginning to glisten, and the cameras caught every detail as he struggled to maintain his composure. This wasn't the Jonathan Roumie the world knew, the confident actor, the man who had masterfully portrayed Christ on screen. This was someone else entirely, someone raw and vulnerable and completely human. "I'd fall to my knees," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion that he could no longer hide. The words came out like a confession that had been locked inside for years, finally finding their way to the surface. Marcus felt his own breath catch as he realized they had moved far beyond a typical celebrity interview into something much more intimate and real. The energy in the room had shifted completely, and everyone present seemed to understand they were witnessing something extraordinary. The production assistant behind the camera made a subtle gesture to Marcus, silently asking if they should cut, but Marcus shook his head almost imperceptibly. "That's not what I expected you to say," Marcus said softly, his own voice gentler now as he recognized the sacred ground they were walking on. Jonathan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so human and unguarded that it made everyone in the studio hold their breath. "I've been running from this conversation my whole life," he said, looking directly into the camera with stunning vulnerability, "but I can't anymore." The admission hung in the air like a prayer, and Marcus knew that whatever came next would change everything. "What conversation?" Marcus asked, though he already sensed the answer would be something that would resonate far beyond this interview. Jonathan took a shaky breath, and for the first time since becoming famous for playing Jesus, he looked completely vulnerable, utterly, transparently human. "The one about who I really am when the cameras stop rolling," he said, his voice barely audible. "The one about the man behind the character, about my own relationship with the Jesus I portray." The silence that followed was deafening, heavy with the weight of truth about to be revealed. "I need to tell you something," Jonathan said, his voice steadier now, but still thick with emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "Something I've never told anyone in public before, something I've been afraid to admit even to myself sometimes." Marcus nodded encouragingly, understanding that they were about to venture into deeply personal territory. Jonathan's hands trembled slightly as he spoke, the weight of years of private struggle finally demanding to be heard. The studio had become a confessional, and Jonathan was about to bare his soul to the world. When I first got the role of Jesus, I thought I was ready for it, Jonathan began, his voice distant as if he was being transported back to those early days. I had studied acting, I had prepared, I thought I understood what I was getting into. He paused, looking out at the cameras as if seeing them for the first time. But nothing could have prepared me for what actually happened when I started trying to become Jesus on screen. The vulnerability in his admission was palpable, and Marcus could sense they were approaching something that would explain everything about Jonathan's transformation. The first time I put on the costume, the first time I looked in the mirror and saw Jesus looking back at me, something broke open inside, Jonathan continued, his voice growing softer and more introspective. It wasn't just about playing a character anymore. It was about coming face to face with my own faith, my own relationship with God, my own understanding of who Jesus really is. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he realized they were diving into the deep end of spiritual territory. "What did you see when you looked in that mirror?" Marcus asked gently. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, as if the memory was too powerful to face head-on. "I saw everything I wasn't," he said simply. "Every way I fell short, every way my life didn't measure up to the character I was supposed to portray." Tears were beginning to flow more freely now, but Jonathan didn't seem to notice or care. "I realized I was about to spend months, maybe years, trying to become someone perfect, while being painfully aware of my own imperfections." The raw honesty in his voice was stunning, and Marcus understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. "How did that realization affect you?" Marcus asked, leaning forward with genuine concern and fascination. Jonathan opened his eyes and looked directly at his interviewer. "It terrified me," he admitted without hesitation. "Here I was, getting ready to portray the Son of God, and I felt like a fraud. I felt like I was the least qualified person in the world for this role." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "But it also did something else. It made me desperate to really know Jesus, not just as a character to portray, but as a real person, as my savior." "Tell me about that desperation," Marcus said, sensing they were getting to the heart of Jonathan's transformation. Jonathan took a deep breath, gathering courage for what he was about to share. "I started spending hours every day in prayer before filming, not just preparing for scenes, but really talking to Jesus, asking him to help me understand who he is." The admission carried the weight of years of private spiritual wrestling. "I would get on my knees in my trailer and beg God to let me do justice to his son's story, to help me disappear so that people would see Jesus and not Jonathan Roumie." Marcus could see the profound impact these prayers had made on Jonathan's life. "And did you feel like those prayers were being answered?" Jonathan nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with fresh tears. "Not in the way I expected," he said softly. "I thought God would make me a better actor, help me nail the performance. Instead, he started changing my heart." The weight of this revelation hung heavy in the air. Every day on set became like a spiritual retreat, like I was having an ongoing conversation with Jesus about who he is and who I'm supposed to be. "But there's something else," Jonathan said, looking directly at Marcus with eyes that held both fear and relief. "Something that happened just last week that made me realize I couldn't keep this private anymore." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, sensing that whatever came next would be even more profound than what they'd already heard. The studio seemed to hold its breath as Jonathan prepared to share something that would clearly cost him emotionally. "What happened last week?" Marcus asked gently. Jonathan's voice dropped to almost a whisper as he began to recount the experience. "I was filming the crucifixion scene, you know, the most intense, most important scene of the entire series. I had been dreading it for months because I knew it would be the ultimate test of whether I could really honor what Jesus went through." His hands began to tremble as he spoke. "We had been preparing for weeks, going over every detail, every word, every movement. But when the day came, when they actually put me on that cross, something happened that I never expected." Marcus leaned forward, completely absorbed in Jonathan's account. What happened? Jonathan closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they were filled with a mixture of awe and terror. About halfway through filming that scene, I stopped acting, he said, his voice barely audible. I wasn't Jonathan Roumie playing Jesus anymore. I was just a man hanging on a cross, feeling the weight of every sin, every failure, every broken relationship I'd ever had. The confession seemed to surprise even Jonathan himself. And in that moment, I understood something about Jesus' love that I had never understood before. What did you understand? Marcus asked, his own voice thick with emotion as he watched Jonathan relive this profound experience. Jonathan looked directly into the camera as if he was speaking to every person who had ever watched this interview. I understood that he really did it for me, not for humanity in general, not for some abstract concept of sin, but for me, Jonathan Roumie, with all my specific failures and fears and shortcomings. His voice grew stronger with each word. He looked down through time and saw me struggling with pride, with doubt, with the pressure of playing him on screen, and he said, "I'll take all of that pain for you." The impact of Jonathan's words was overwhelming, and Marcus found himself fighting back tears as well. How did that realization change you? He asked. Jonathan smiled through his tears, and for the first time in the interview, there was pure joy on his face. It broke me completely and healed me at the same time, he said. I realized that all my anxiety about being worthy to play Jesus was missing the point. Nobody is worthy of his love, but he gives it anyway. The transformation in Jonathan's demeanor was visible to everyone watching. That's when I knew I had to tell this story, had to be honest about what this role has done to my faith. But there's more, Jonathan said, his voice growing urgent, as if he needed to get everything out before he lost his nerve. Something that happened right after we finished filming that day, that confirmed everything I had just experienced. Marcus waited, sensing that the most powerful part of Jonathan's story was yet to come. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every nuance of this unprecedented moment of vulnerability from one of television's most beloved actors. What happened after filming? Marcus asked. Jonathan took a shaky breath before continuing. When they took me down from the cross, when the cameras stopped rolling, I couldn't move for almost an hour. I just sat there in that costume, still feeling the presence of someone, so powerful that I couldn't shake it off. His voice was filled with wonder as he recounted the experience. The whole crew was cleaning up around me, getting ready for the next shot, but I felt like I was in a different dimension, like I was still connected to something eternal. Marcus could see that this memory was as fresh and powerful for Jonathan as if it had happened yesterday. And then, Marcus prompted gently, understanding that Jonathan needed encouragement to continue sharing this deeply personal experience. Jonathan looked down at his hands, then back up with eyes that seemed to see something beyond the studio walls. Dallas Jenkins, our director, came over and sat beside me. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat there with me in the silence. A small smile crossed Jonathan's face. Finally, he asked me if I was okay, and I told him I didn't think I would ever be the same again. And he said something that I'll never forget. What did he say? Marcus asked, completely drawn into Jonathan's narrative. Jonathan's voice took on a reverent tone as he repeated the director's words. He said, "Jonathan, I think you just experienced what every believer should experience. The moment when Jesus stops being a character in a story and becomes the real, living God who loves you personally." The words hung in the air with profound weight. That's when I knew that this role wasn't just a job anymore. It was a calling, and it was changing me from the inside out. Marcus could see the profound impact this experience had made on Jonathan's understanding of his work. How did that change your approach to the role going forward? Jonathan considered the question carefully before responding. Every scene after that became a form of prayer, he said simply. I wasn't just trying to portray Jesus accurately. I was trying to commune with him, to let his character flow through me instead of me trying to manufacture it. The depth of Jonathan's spiritual transformation was evident in every word. I realized that the best way to honor Jesus on screen was to let him change me off screen. That's a profound way to approach the role, Marcus observed, clearly moved by Jonathan's honesty. But it must have also made the work more emotionally demanding. Jonathan nodded vigorously. Absolutely. There were days when I would finish filming and feel completely drained, not just physically but spiritually and emotionally. He paused, gathering his thoughts, but there were also days when I felt more alive and connected to God than I ever had before. It was like the role was stripping away all my pretenses and forcing me to be real about my faith. Can you give me an example of one of those challenging days? Marcus asked, sensing that Jonathan had specific experiences he was eager to share. Jonathan's expression grew serious as he recalled a particular memory. There was a day when we were filming Jesus' encounter with the woman caught in adultery. You know, the scene where the religious leaders bring her to Jesus, expecting him to condemn her. His voice grew softer. As I was preparing for that scene, I started thinking about all the ways I judge people, all the ways I fall short of the grace Jesus showed that woman. That must have been a difficult realization, Marcus said gently. Jonathan nodded, his eyes filling with tears again. It was devastating and beautiful at the same time. I realized that I was just as much in need of Jesus' grace as that woman was, just as much in need of his forgiveness. He wiped his eyes, continuing with raw honesty. When we filmed that scene, when I had to speak the words, "Go and sin no more," I felt like Jesus was speaking them directly to me, offering me the same grace he offered her. Marcus was struck by the depth of Jonathan's personal connection to the role. It sounds like playing Jesus has been like an ongoing spiritual retreat for you. Jonathan laughed softly, a sound filled with both joy and exhaustion. That's exactly what it's been like. Every day on set has been like a master class in Christianity, taught by Jesus himself through the scriptures we're bringing to life. His voice grew more passionate. I've learned more about faith, about grace, about God's love in the past few years than I had in decades of church attendance. But with that spiritual growth must have come challenges as well, Marcus observed. How has this transformation affected your personal life? Jonathan's expression grew more contemplative as he considered the question. It's been the most challenging and rewarding experience of my life, he admitted. On one hand, I feel closer to God than I ever have before. On the other hand, I feel the weight of responsibility more heavily than I ever imagined possible. He paused, choosing his words carefully. When people see you as Jesus on screen, they expect a certain level of holiness in real life, and that pressure can be overwhelming. How do you handle that pressure? Marcus asked, clearly interested in the practical challenges of Jonathan's unique situation. Jonathan sighed deeply before responding. Some days better than others, he admitted, with disarming honesty. There are days when I feel like I'm living up to the calling, and there are days when I feel like a complete hypocrite. His vulnerability was stunning in its completeness. But I've learned that the point isn't to be perfect. The point is to be honest about my need for Jesus' grace, both on screen and off. Marcus could see that Jonathan was approaching something even more personal and profound. Is there a specific moment when you felt most like a hypocrite? He asked gently. Jonathan closed his eyes, clearly accessing a painful memory. About 6 months ago, I had what you might call a crisis of faith, he began slowly. I was going through some personal struggles, dealing with relationships, dealing with the pressure of fame, and I started questioning everything. His voice grew quieter. I remember thinking, how can I play Jesus when I feel so far from God right now? That must have been incredibly difficult, Marcus said, his voice filled with compassion. How did you work through that crisis? Jonathan opened his eyes and looked directly at Marcus. I almost quit the show, he admitted, the words coming out like a confession he'd been holding back for months. I called Dallas and told him I didn't think I could continue. Then I felt like a fraud. The weight of this revelation was evident in his voice. I told him that people deserved better than an actor who was struggling with his own faith, playing the Son of God. What did Dallas say to that? Marcus asked, completely absorbed in Jonathan's story. Jonathan smiled slightly, remembering his director's response. He told me that my struggles didn't disqualify me from the role. They qualified me for it. He said that Jesus came for people who are struggling, not for people who have it all figured out. The wisdom in these words was clearly something Jonathan had clung to during his darkest moments. He reminded me that every person who follows Jesus has moments of doubt, moments of feeling distant from God, and that my honesty about those struggles might help other people feel less alone in theirs. Marcus leaned back, processing the depth of what Jonathan was sharing. That's a profound perspective. How did that conversation change your approach to the role? Jonathan's entire demeanor seemed to lighten as he responded. It freed me to be human while playing Jesus, he said with obvious relief. I realized that the goal wasn't to be perfect, but to be authentic about my journey with God, even when that journey included valleys and doubts. His voice grew stronger. That's when I understood that my struggles could actually make me a better vessel for God's message, because people could see that grace is real and available, even to those who don't have it all together. Speaking of authenticity, Marcus said, "Can you tell me about a time when your personal faith was most directly challenged by playing this role?" Jonathan considered the question for a long moment before responding. There was a scene we filmed where Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, sweating blood, asking God if there's any other way. His voice grew hushed with reverence. As I was preparing for that scene, I realized I had never really understood the humanity of Jesus, the real fear and anguish he experienced, knowing what was coming. "How did that realization affect you?" Marcus asked. Jonathan's eyes filled with tears as he remembered the experience. "It broke my heart and healed it at the same time," he said softly. "I realized that Jesus wasn't just going through the motions of suffering. He was genuinely afraid, genuinely anguished, genuinely human in his pain." He paused, wiping his eyes. But he chose obedience anyway, chose to trust the Father anyway, chose love anyway. That's when I understood what real faith looks like. Not the absence of fear, but choosing to trust God even when you're afraid. Marcus could see that this understanding had profoundly shaped Jonathan's faith. How did that change your own approach to difficult situations in your life? Jonathan smiled through his tears. "It gave me permission to be afraid while still choosing faith," he said. "I learned that I don't have to pretend to be strong or have all the answers. I can bring my fears and doubts to God just like Jesus did, and trust that God will give me the strength I need to keep going." The practical wisdom in his words was evident. It made my faith more real and less performative. If you're watching this incredibly raw moment, where Jonathan Roumie is sharing the deepest truths about his faith journey, if you believe that authentic spirituality is more powerful than perfect performances, go ahead and hit that like button and comment the word faith below. Let's see how many of us understand that the most powerful testimonies come from broken people who've encountered the grace of God. "Jonathan," Marcus said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I want to ask you about something that I think many people struggle with. How do you balance your role as an actor with your role as what some might call an evangelist?" Jonathan shifted in his chair, clearly considering how to address this complex question. "That's something I wrestle with every day," he admitted honestly. "I never set out to be an evangelist. I just wanted to tell a good story about Jesus. But I've learned that when you portray Christ authentically, evangelism becomes inevitable." His voice grew more confident. People see something real in the portrayal and start asking questions about their own faith. "Has that been a comfortable transition for you?" Marcus asked. Jonathan laughed, but not with humor, with the recognition of how challenging this role had become. "Comfortable? Not at all," he said frankly. "I'm an actor, not a preacher. I never went to seminary, never felt called to pastoral ministry." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "But I've learned that God doesn't always call the equipped, sometimes He equips the called. And if my portrayal of Jesus helps even one person understand His love better, then I'll embrace whatever label comes with that responsibility." "That's a significant responsibility," Marcus observed. "How do you prepare yourself spiritually for the weight of that calling?" Jonathan's response revealed the depth of his spiritual practices. "I spend hours in prayer and Bible study every day now," he said. "Not just preparing for scenes, but really studying Jesus' character, His teachings, His heart for people." His voice grew more passionate. I read theologians, I talk to pastors, I try to surround myself with people who can help me grow in my understanding of who Jesus really is. Because if I'm going to help people see him, I need to see him clearly myself. Can you share about a time when that preparation led to a personal breakthrough? Marcus asked. Jonathan's eyes lit up as he recalled a specific memory. A few months ago, I was studying Jesus' interaction with the disciples after his resurrection, particularly when he cooked breakfast for them on the beach. His voice took on a tone of wonder. As I was reading that passage over and over, trying to understand Jesus' heart in that moment, I was struck by how gentle he was with them, how he didn't condemn them for abandoning him during the crucifixion. The impact of this realization was evident in Jonathan's voice. What struck you most about that gentleness? Marcus prompted. Jonathan leaned forward, his passion evident. I realized that Jesus' first priority after rising from the dead wasn't to lecture the disciples about their failures. It was to care for their basic needs, to cook them a meal, to restore their relationship with him. His voice grew softer. That taught me something profound about grace. It's not just forgiveness, it's active love that seeks to restore and heal. The theological depth of his insight was remarkable. It changed how I interact with people who have hurt or disappointed me. Marcus was clearly moved by Jonathan's spiritual growth. It sounds like playing Jesus has been transformative, not just professionally, but personally. Jonathan nodded emphatically. It's been the most transformative experience of my life, he confirmed. I thought I knew who Jesus was before I started this role. I thought I understood the gospel, understood grace, understood what it meant to follow Christ. He paused, his expression growing more humble. But I was wrong. Or rather, I was operating from head knowledge instead of heart knowledge. This role has moved my faith from my head to my heart in ways I never expected. Can you explain what you mean by head knowledge versus heart knowledge? Marcus asked, clearly intrigued by this distinction. Jonathan took a moment to gather his thoughts before responding. Head knowledge is knowing that Jesus loves you. It's intellectual, theological, something you can explain to others. His voice grew more intimate. Heart knowledge is feeling Jesus' love so deeply that it changes how you see yourself, how you see others, how you move through the world. He paused for emphasis. Head knowledge informs your thoughts. Heart knowledge transforms your being. And this role moved you from one to the other? Marcus clarified. Jonathan's response was immediate and certain. Absolutely. When you spend months trying to embody Jesus' character, when you have to access his compassion, his patience, his love for difficult people, you can't help but be changed by it. His voice grew more excited. You start to see people the way Jesus sees them, not as problems to be solved or projects to be fixed, but as beloved children of God who are struggling just like you are. The transformation in Jonathan's perspective was evident in every word. Marcus leaned forward, sensing they were approaching something even more profound. Jonathan, I want to ask you something very personal. Has there been a moment during this journey when you felt like Jesus was speaking directly to you, not as a character you were portraying, but as your personal savior? The question seemed to hit Jonathan like a physical blow, and fresh tears immediately sprang to his eyes. He was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with whether to share something deeply personal. Yes, Jonathan finally whispered, his voice barely audible, and it happened in a way I never could have expected. Marcus waited, sensing that whatever Jonathan was about to share would be the most powerful part of his testimony. The studio was completely silent, everyone present understanding they were about to witness something sacred. It was during a scene we were filming for the upcoming season, Jonathan began, his voice growing stronger as he committed to telling the story. We were filming Jesus' encounter with the thief on the cross. You know, the man who asked Jesus to remember him when he came into his kingdom. Jonathan's voice was filled with reverence as he set the scene. I had been preparing for this scene for weeks because I knew it was one of the most powerful moments in all of Scripture. This man who had lived a life of crime finding salvation in his final moments. His hands began to tremble slightly as he continued, but when we started filming, something happened that I wasn't prepared for. What happened? Marcus asked gently, his own voice hushed with anticipation. Jonathan closed his eyes, accessing the memory. As I was speaking Jesus' words to the thief, "Today you will be with me in paradise," I suddenly felt like Jesus was speaking those words to me personally. His voice cracked with emotion. All my fears about not being worthy to play him, all my guilt about my past failures, all my anxiety about the future, it all just melted away in that moment. The transformation was visible on Jonathan's face as he relived the experience. I felt this overwhelming sense of peace and acceptance that I had never experienced before. Jonathan continued, tears flowing freely now. It was like Jesus was saying to me, "Jonathan, you don't have to earn my love. You don't have to be perfect to serve me. You just have to trust that my grace is sufficient for you." The depth of this personal revelation was stunning. That's when I knew for certain that this role wasn't just about acting, it was about my own relationship with Jesus, my own need for his salvation. Marcus was visibly moved by Jonathan's testimony. How did that experience change your approach to the rest of your life? Jonathan's response revealed the comprehensive impact of his encounter with Christ. "It changed everything," he said simply. "My relationships, my priorities, my understanding of success and failure, my approach to challenges, everything got filtered through this new understanding of grace." His voice grew more confident. "I stopped trying to be perfect and started trying to be faithful. I stopped worrying about what people thought of me and started focusing on what God thought of me." "That must have been incredibly freeing," Marcus observed. Jonathan nodded enthusiastically. "It was the most freeing experience of my life," he confirmed. "For the first time, I understood what Jesus meant when he said his yoke is easy and his burden is light." He paused, his expression growing more reflective. "It's not that following Jesus is without challenges, but it's that you're not carrying those challenges alone. You're not trying to be good enough on your own strength. You're depending on his strength, his goodness, his love." Marcus could see that this understanding had become central to Jonathan's faith. "How has this perspective affected your relationships with other people?" Jonathan's face lit up as he considered the question. "It's made me so much more patient and forgiving," he said. "When you really understand how much grace God has shown you, it becomes easier to extend that same grace to others." His voice grew more passionate. "I used to judge people pretty harshly, especially people whose lifestyles or choices I didn't agree with. But now I see them the way Jesus sees them, as people in need of love and grace. Just like me." "Can you give me a specific example of how this has played out in your life?" Marcus asked. Jonathan considered the question carefully before responding. "There's someone in my life who hurt me deeply a few years ago. I won't go into details to protect their privacy, but it was a significant betrayal that left me angry and bitter." His voice grew softer as he continued. "For a long time I held on to that anger, justified it, fed it, but after experiencing Jesus' grace so powerfully through this role, I realized I had to forgive them. Not because they deserved it, but because that's what grace does. It forgives the undeservable." "Was that forgiveness difficult?" Marcus asked. Jonathan's honesty was refreshing. "It was one of the hardest things I've ever done," he admitted. "Every part of me wanted to hold on to the anger, wanted them to pay for what they had done." He paused, his expression growing more peaceful. "But I kept coming back to Jesus' words on the cross, 'Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.' If Jesus could forgive the people who were killing him, how could I not forgive someone who had hurt me?" The transformation in Jonathan's perspective was profound. "And how did that forgiveness change you?" Marcus asked. Jonathan's response revealed the power of grace to heal. "It set me free in ways I never expected," he said. "I realized that holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die." His voice grew stronger. "But forgiveness, real, grace-based forgiveness, it broke the chains that were keeping me bound to that hurt. It allowed me to move forward with my life, to love more freely, to trust more deeply." The liberation in his voice was unmistakable. Marcus leaned back, processing the depth of Jonathan's transformation. "Jonathan, I want to ask you something that I think many people struggle with. How do you maintain this level of spiritual intensity and authenticity in an industry that's often seen as superficial or corrupting?" Jonathan's response revealed his practical approach to maintaining his faith in Hollywood. That's definitely a challenge, he admitted honestly. The entertainment industry can be a difficult place to maintain your values and priorities. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But I've learned that my faith isn't something I check at the door. It's who I am, and it influences every decision I make. How do you practically live that out? Marcus asked. Jonathan's answer revealed the disciplines that kept him grounded. I start every day with prayer and Bible reading, not just when I'm preparing for Jesus scenes, but every single day, he said. I surround myself with people who share my values and will hold me accountable. His voice grew more emphatic, and I constantly remind myself that my identity isn't Jonathan Roumie the actor. It's Jonathan Roumie, beloved child of God who happens to act. The distinction was clearly important to him. That's a powerful perspective, Marcus observed. How has your understanding of success changed through this journey? Jonathan's response revealed a complete reframing of his values. Success used to be about career achievements, critical acclaim, financial security, all external measures, he said. Now success is about faithfulness to God's calling on my life, about using whatever platform I have to point people toward Jesus, about becoming more like Christ in my character. His voice grew more passionate. If I never act again after The Chosen ends, but people's lives were changed because they encountered Jesus through the show, I'll consider my career a complete success. Marcus was struck by the sincerity of Jonathan's words. That's a radical redefinition of success for someone in your industry. Jonathan nodded, acknowledging the countercultural nature of his perspective. It is radical, and it's not always easy to maintain, he admitted. There are still moments when I'm tempted by the old definitions of success, when I want recognition or acclaim for its own sake. His honesty was refreshing. But then I remember why I'm really here, what God has called me to do, and those other things lose their appeal. Nothing compares to the joy of knowing you're walking in God's will. Jonathan, Marcus said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, I want to ask you about something that might be difficult. Have there been any negative reactions to your faith journey, either from industry colleagues or from fans? Jonathan's expression grew more somber as he considered the question. Yes, there have been some challenging responses, he admitted. Some people in the industry think I've become too religious, that I'm limiting my career options by being so open about my faith. He paused, gathering courage to continue. And there are some fans who prefer to see Jesus as a historical figure rather than a living savior, so my personal testimony makes them uncomfortable. How do you handle that criticism? Marcus asked. Jonathan's response revealed his maturity and grace under pressure. I try to respond with love and understanding, he said. I realize that my faith journey might challenge people's comfort zones, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. His voice grew more confident. But I also can't compromise who I am or what I believe just to make other people comfortable. If my testimony helps even one person encounter Jesus personally, then any criticism is worth it. The conviction in his voice was unmistakable. Marcus could see that Jonathan had clearly thought deeply about these challenges. What would you say to other actors or public figures who might be afraid to speak openly about their faith? Jonathan's response was both encouraging and practical. I'd tell them that authenticity is always better than hiding who you really are, he said. Yes, there might be professional consequences, but there's also incredible freedom in being able to live and work as your whole self. He paused for emphasis. And I'd remind them that God is bigger than Marcus could see, that Jonathan had clearly thought deeply about these challenges. What would you say to other actors or public figures who might be afraid to speak openly about their faith? Jonathan's response was both encouraging and practical. I'd tell them that authenticity is always better than hiding who you really are, he said. Yes, there might be professional consequences, but there's also incredible freedom in being able to live and work as your whole self. He paused for emphasis. And I'd remind them that God is bigger than any career, any industry, any human approval we might lose by standing up for what we believe. That takes real courage, Marcus observed. Jonathan's eyes lit up as he responded. You know what I've learned about courage? It's not the absence of fear, it's doing what's right even when you're afraid. His voice grew more passionate. Every time I've chosen to be honest about my faith, even when it scared me, God has blessed that obedience in ways I never expected. He leaned forward, speaking directly to the camera. If you're watching this, and you're afraid to let people know about your relationship with Jesus, I want to encourage you. He's worth whatever you might lose. And he'll give you strength you didn't know you had. Marcus was moved by Jonathan's encouragement to viewers. Speaking of encouragement, what would you say to someone who's watching this and feeling like they're not good enough for God, like they've made too many mistakes or gone too far from faith? Jonathan's expression softened with compassion as he considered this question. I would tell them exactly what Jesus told me through this role. God's love isn't based on your performance, it's based on his character. His voice grew gentle but firm. You can't out-sin God's grace, you can't go too far for his love to reach you. You can't mess up so badly that he gives up on you. That's a powerful message. Nashon, Marcus said. How do you know that with such certainty? Jonathan's response came from deep personal experience. Because I've lived it, he said simply. Every failure, every doubt, every moment when I felt unworthy to portray Jesus, he met me in those places with love, not condemnation. His voice grew stronger. The thief on the cross had lived a life of crime, but in his final moments Jesus welcomed him into paradise. If there's grace for him, there's grace for anyone. If there's grace for me, there's grace for everyone watching this. Marcus could see that this message was central to Jonathan's understanding of the gospel. How has this experience of grace changed your approach to sharing your faith with others? Jonathan's response revealed his heart for evangelism. It's made me more bold and more gentle at the same time, he said. Bold because I know the gospel is true and life-changing. Gentle because I remember how patient God was with me in my journey to faith. He paused thoughtfully. I used to think evangelism was about having all the right arguments or answers. Now I realize it's mostly about sharing your story and letting the Holy Spirit do the work of conviction and conversion. Can you share about a time when you had the opportunity to share your faith with someone in a natural way? Marcus asked. Jonathan smiled as he recalled a specific memory. Just last month, I was on a plane, and the person sitting next to me recognized me from the show. His voice took on a warm tone. She started telling me about how The Chosen had helped her through a difficult divorce, how seeing Jesus' compassion had given her hope again. The joy in Jonathan's voice was evident. By the end of the flight, we were praying together, and she was asking Jesus into her heart for the first time. That must have been an incredible experience, Marcus said. Jonathan nodded enthusiastically. It was one of the most beautiful moments of my life, he confirmed. But here's what struck me. I didn't have to convince her of anything. The Holy Spirit had already been working in her heart through the show, through her circumstances, through her need for hope. His voice grew more reflective. All I had to do was listen to her story, share a little bit of mine, and point her toward Jesus. He did all the real work. The humility in his perspective was striking. Marcus leaned forward, sensing they were approaching the conclusion of this remarkable interview. Jonathan, as we wrap up, I want to ask you about the future. How has this journey changed your perspective on what comes next in your life and career? Jonathan's response revealed someone who had found true peace about his purpose. Honestly, I'm not as concerned about my career trajectory as I used to be, he said. Don't get me wrong, I love acting, and I hope to continue doing meaningful work, but my primary goal now is to be faithful to whatever God calls me to do next. His voice grew more confident. Whether that's more acting or speaking or writing or something completely different, I just want to be available to him. That's a beautiful surrender, Marcus observed. What do you hope people take away from hearing your story today? Jonathan looked directly into the camera, speaking with the passion of someone who had experienced transformation firsthand. I hope they understand that God can use anyone, even someone who feels unworthy, even someone who's struggled with doubt, even someone who's made mistakes. His voice grew more urgent. I hope they see that faith isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest about your need for grace and trusting that Jesus is enough to meet that need. The conviction in his words was unmistakable, and specifically to those who might be struggling with their own faith journey. Marcus prompted. Jonathan's response came from the depths of his own experience. I'd tell them that it's okay to wrestle with God. It's okay to have questions. It's okay to go through seasons of doubt. His voice was filled with compassion. Jacob wrestled with God all night and walked away blessed. Doubt isn't the opposite of faith. Apathy is. If you're wrestling with spiritual questions, that means your heart is still soft toward God, and He can work with that. The wisdom in his words reflected years of personal spiritual struggle. Marcus was clearly moved by Jonathan's pastoral heart. What role do you see the chosen playing in people's spiritual journeys? Jonathan's eyes lit up as he considered this question. I see it as a bridge, he said thoughtfully. For people who have been hurt by church or turned off by religion, the show offers a way to encounter Jesus without all the baggage. His voice grew more excited. For people who've never heard the gospel, it's an introduction to who Jesus really is. For believers, it's a fresh look at familiar stories that can deepen their faith. The evangelical heart behind his work was evident. That's a significant ministry impact, Marcus noted. How do you handle the pressure of knowing that your portrayal might be someone's first encounter with Jesus? Jonathan's response revealed both humility and confidence. It's overwhelming when I think about it too much, he admitted honestly. But I've learned to trust that God is sovereign over how people respond to the show. His voice grew steadier. My job is to be faithful to the character as revealed in Scripture, to bring my whole heart to the performance, and to pray that the Holy Spirit will use it however He sees fit. The results are up to Him, not me. Marcus could see that this perspective brought Jonathan peace. As someone who has experienced such transformation through playing Jesus, what would you say to critics who argue that faith is just psychological, that religious experiences can be explained away? Jonathan's response was thoughtful and measured. I'd say that of course faith has psychological components. We're human beings with minds and emotions, and God designed us that way. His voice grew more confident. But the transformation I've experienced goes beyond psychology. It's affected my character, my relationships, my priorities in ways that can't be explained by wishful thinking or self-hypnosis. The authenticity of his conviction was compelling. Can you elaborate on that? Marcus asked. Jonathan nodded, clearly having thought deeply about this question. Psychology might explain why believing in something makes you feel better temporarily, but it doesn't explain why faith produces lasting character change. Why it gives you strength to forgive people who've hurt you, why it compels you to serve others sacrificially. His voice grew more passionate. It doesn't explain answered prayers, providential circumstances, or the peace that surpasses understanding that comes even in the midst of difficult circumstances. His personal testimony was powerful evidence for the reality of faith. Marcus was impressed by the depth of Jonathan's reasoning. Those are compelling points. What would you say to someone who wants to experience that kind of transformation but doesn't know where to start? Jonathan's response was practical and accessible. Start with honesty, he said simply. Be honest with God about where you are, about your doubts, about your need for Him. His voice grew gentler. You don't have to have perfect faith to approach God, you just have to have real faith, even if it's small. Tell Him you want to know Him, ask Him to reveal Himself to you, and then pay attention to how He responds. The simplicity of his approach was refreshing. And then, Marcus prompted. Jonathan's advice continued to be practical and encouraging. Then start reading the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, with an open heart, asking God to help you understand who Jesus really is. His voice took on the tone of someone giving directions to a treasured destination. Find a community of believers who can encourage you and answer your questions. And be patient with yourself. Faith is a journey, not a destination. God is more interested in your heart than your performance. The wisdom in his counsel reflected someone who had walked this path himself. Marcus could see that Jonathan genuinely cared about helping others find faith. What role do you see art and entertainment playing in people's spiritual journeys? Jonathan's response revealed his understanding of the power of storytelling. "I think art has always been one of God's favorite ways to reach people's hearts," he said thoughtfully. "Stories bypass our intellectual defenses and speak directly to our souls." His voice grew more animated. "When people watch The Chosen and their hearts are moved by Jesus' compassion, that's not just good storytelling. That's the Holy Spirit using art to draw people to Himself." The theological insight was profound. "That's a beautiful way to think about it," Marcus observed. "How do you balance the artistic and the evangelical aspects of your work?" Jonathan's response showed his mature understanding of both calling. "I've learned that the best evangelism happens when you're not trying to evangelize," he said with a smile. "When you focus on telling the story truthfully and beautifully, when you bring authentic emotion and genuine reverence to the work, the evangelical impact happens naturally." His voice grew more serious. "People can sense when you're being manipulative or when you have an agenda, but they can also sense when you're being authentic and when you genuinely love the character you're portraying." Marcus was struck by this insight. "So authenticity is the key to both good art and effective ministry?" Jonathan nodded emphatically. "Absolutely. Jesus was the most authentic person who ever lived. Completely genuine, completely transparent about who he was and what he believed." His voice grew more confident. "When you try to portray him authentically, when you let his character shine through instead of trying to manufacture some version of him, people recognize the truth of who he is." The connection between artistic integrity and spiritual impact was clear. "Jonathan, I want to ask you something personal," Marcus said, his tone becoming more intimate. "How has this journey affected your relationship with your family and closest friends?" Jonathan's expression softened as he considered this question. "It's deepened all of my relationships in the most beautiful ways," he said warmly. "When you're experiencing God's love more fully, it overflows into how you love other people." His voice took on a tone of gratitude. "I'm more patient with my family, more forgiving with my friends, more compassionate with strangers. Love begets love, and grace begets grace." "Have there been any challenges in your relationships because of your spiritual growth?" Marcus asked. Jonathan's honesty continued to be refreshing. "Some people have been uncomfortable with the changes in me," he admitted. "Not because I've become judgmental or preachy, but because deep spiritual transformation can make others feel convicted about their own spiritual lives." His voice remained gentle. "I've had to learn to be patient with people who are at different places in their journey, to love them where they are while still being authentic about where God has brought me." The maturity in his approach was evident. Marcus could see that Jonathan had navigated these relational challenges with wisdom. "What advice would you give to someone whose spiritual growth is creating tension in their relationships?" Jonathan's response was pastoral and practical. "Love them well and be patient," he said simply. "Don't try to force your spiritual experience on others, but don't hide who you've become either." His voice grew more thoughtful. "Sometimes the best evangelism is just living a life so full of joy and peace that people start asking questions about what's different about you." The wisdom of his approach was compelling. "That's beautiful counsel," Marcus said. "As we approach the end of our time, I want to ask you about legacy. How do you hope to be remembered?" Jonathan's response revealed his eternal perspective. "I hope to be remembered as someone who pointed people toward Jesus," he said without hesitation. "Not as a great actor or a celebrity, but as someone who used whatever platform God gave him to help others encounter the love of Christ." His voice grew more passionate. "If people remember The Chosen, and it leads them to read the Gospels, if they remember my testimony today and it encourages them to explore faith, then I'll have fulfilled my purpose." The clarity of his priorities was striking. Marcus was moved by Jonathan's perspective on legacy. "What do you want to say to young actors or artists who might be inspired by your example?" Jonathan looked directly into the camera, speaking with the authority of someone who had walked a difficult path successfully. "Use your gifts for something bigger than yourself," he said firmly. "Don't just pursue success or fame. Pursue purpose, pursue meaning, pursue the opportunity to make a difference in people's lives." His voice grew more urgent. And don't be afraid to let your faith influence your art. The world needs artists who aren't ashamed of their relationship with God, who can create beauty that points to the ultimate source of all beauty. Those are powerful words, Marcus said. What final message do you have for everyone watching this today? Jonathan took a deep breath, clearly wanting to choose his words carefully for this culminating moment. I want everyone to know that no matter where you are in your spiritual journey, no matter what you've done or left undone, Jesus is calling your name, he said with deep conviction. He's not waiting for you to get your act together or become a better person. He's calling you right now, exactly as you are, because he loves you exactly as you are. The love in his voice was overwhelming. How can people respond to that call? Marcus asked gently. Jonathan's response was simple and direct. Just talk to him, he said. Prayer doesn't have to be formal or fancy, just honest conversation with God about your life, your struggles, your hopes. His voice grew softer. Tell him you want to know him. Ask him to come into your life, and then trust that he will respond to that sincere invitation. The accessibility of his message was beautiful. He's been waiting for that conversation your whole life. Marcus could feel the power of this moment. Any final thoughts as we conclude? Jonathan nodded, his eyes glistening with tears of gratitude. I just want to thank God for the incredible journey he's taken me on through this role, he said. I never could have imagined when I first auditioned for The Chosen that it would become the most transformative experience of my life. His voice grew stronger. But that's how God works. He takes our small offerings and does immeasurably more than we could ask or imagine. If he can use me, he can use anyone. Jonathan, thank you for your incredible transparency and vulnerability today, Marcus said, clearly moved by everything he had heard. This has been one of the most powerful interviews I've ever conducted. Jonathan smiled through his tears. Thank you for creating a space where I could be honest about my journey, he replied. I pray that something we've shared today will encourage someone who's watching to take their own step toward Jesus. The sincerity in his gratitude was evident. As the cameras stopped rolling, the studio remained silent for several moments, everyone present processing the weight of what they had just witnessed. Jonathan sat quietly, emotionally drained but peaceful, having finally shared the deepest truths of his spiritual journey with the world. Marcus reached across and shook his hand, both men understanding that they had participated in something much more significant than a typical celebrity interview. That was extraordinary, Marcus said quietly as the crew began to pack up equipment around them. I've never seen someone so willing to be vulnerable about their faith on camera. Jonathan nodded, still processing his own emotions from the experience. It felt like the right time to tell that story, he said. I've been carrying it for so long, and I felt like God was finally giving me permission to share it publicly. The relief in his voice was palpable. Within hours of the interview airing, social media exploded with responses from viewers around the world. Comments poured in from people sharing their own spiritual struggles, thanking Jonathan for his honesty, and asking questions about faith. Many viewers reported being moved to tears by his testimony, with several sharing that they had prayed to receive Christ after watching the interview. The impact was immediate and profound. Christian leaders and pastors across the country began sharing clips from the interview, using Jonathan's testimony as a powerful example of authentic faith lived out in the public eye. Several seminaries reached out asking if he would consider speaking to their students about the intersection of faith and art. The interview had clearly struck a chord in ways that extended far beyond the entertainment industry. In the days following the broadcast, Jonathan received thousands of messages from viewers sharing how his story had impacted them. Many were from people who had been afraid to speak openly about their own faith, encouraged by his example to be more authentic about their beliefs. Others were from seekers who had been inspired to explore Christianity for the first time. The ripple effects of his vulnerability were far-reaching and deeply meaningful. Looking back on the interview weeks later, Jonathan reflected on how liberating it had been to finally share his complete story. I didn't realize how much energy I was spending trying to manage my public image until I stopped, he would tell friends, "There's incredible freedom in just being honest about who you are and what you believe." The peace that had settled over his life since the interview was evident to everyone who knew him. The interview also marked a turning point in how Jonathan approached his public platform. He began speaking more boldly about his faith in subsequent interviews, sharing his testimony at churches and Christian events, and using his social media presence to encourage others in their spiritual journeys. What had begun as an acting role had clearly evolved into a full-fledged ministry calling. Have you ever experienced a moment when sharing your deepest truth, despite the fear, brought unexpected freedom and peace? Have you witnessed how authentic vulnerability can touch hearts in ways that polished performances never can? Jonathan Roumie's breakdown during this interview reminds us that sometimes our most powerful moments come not when we have it all together, but when we finally stop pretending and let people see our real journey with God. Like, subscribe, and share if you believe that authentic faith is more powerful than perfect facades, and that God can use our struggles and questions to draw others closer to Him.